In the haze of frantic headlines, trade deals, retaliatory tariffs, and last-minute negotiations, something deeper has quietly taken shape, far beyond the noise of commodity charts and political speeches. A fundamental shift is underway, not simply in economics, but in the architecture of the modern world order itself. For nearly 8 decades, the United States was the primary force behind the construction of an open, rules-based global economy. It actively lowered its own barriers, encouraged others to do the same, and built alliances around mutual access to markets, the free flow of capital, and the belief that economic interdependence was an antidote to war. That era is ending. In the second term of President Donald Trump, the United States has adopted its highest average tariff rates in nearly 100 years. It now maintains the most protectionist trade stance of any major economy. The changes are not just tactical, they are strategic, deliberate, and grounded in a different worldview. One that sees economic openness as a liability, not a strength. One that treats allies no differently than rivals and measures outcomes not in shared gains, but in relative wins. Supporters of the policy argue that it is about fairness, that for too long the United States was taken advantage of, exploited by foreign competitors, and betrayed by allies. And so, tariffs have become the blunt instrument of correction. But this transformation is not merely an American affair, it is reshaping the logic of globalization itself. The White House has promoted recent trade deals as triumphs, asserting that President Trump has now opened foreign markets to American goods. The rhetorical implication is one of conquest, as if closed economies had been pried open by force. But such characterizations ignore the actual data. Before Trump's second term began, the average tariff imposed on American goods entering the European Union stood at 1.35%. The United States, for its part, levied an average tariff of 1.47% on goods arriving from the European Union. Japan, long viewed as a protectionist state, maintained an average tariff on U.S. products of approximately 3%. Meanwhile, American tariffs on Japanese goods hovered around 1.5%. In short, the international trading environment was already remarkably open. Tariffs across the developed world had reached levels so low that for most industries, they were effectively negligible. Non-tariff barriers certainly remained. Every country, including the United States, employed regulations and standards that shaped trade flows. But the core principle of low-tariff commerce was largely uncontested until now. The administration's defenders argue that even if tariffs rise, they can be used as leverage. That through strategic pressure, the United States can extract concessions and force partners into more favorable terms. There is truth in this, but it is a truth with consequences. By targeting close allies such as the European Union, Japan, and South Korea, the United States is weaponizing its geopolitical position. It is leveraging not just economic scale, but also military relationships, diplomatic dependencies, and security guarantees. And it is doing so in an era when geopolitical tensions, particularly involving Russia and China, are on the rise. The logic is clear. The United States provides security. It hosts key military installations. It maintains fleets and shields supply lines. In return, it now demands economic compliance. In this context, the reduction of European tariffs from 1.35% to near zero may be cast as a win, but it is a marginal one, achieved at the cost of precedent. For decades, the United States pushed against the idea of using economic coercion against friends. It made the case that open trade was not a favor, but a shared good. That global prosperity was not a zero-sum game. That leadership was earned through restraint, not extraction. That philosophy has been reversed. From a purely domestic perspective, the implications are equally complex. In the year 2024, exports accounted for less than 11% of United States gross domestic product. The American economy is not export-driven. It is largely internal, built on consumption and services. more than 80% of American non-farm employment resides in the service sector. From entertainment and tourism to finance, software, consulting, and beyond, the United States dominates in areas where tariffs barely apply. In fact, in 2024, the United States recorded a trade surplus of nearly $300 billion in services, and yet these sectors are not the focus of tariff policy. The administration has concentrated almost exclusively on physical goods, where the United States often runs trade deficits, but where consumers are most exposed. Tariffs on imports are, by their nature, taxes. They raise the cost of foreign goods. For high-income consumers, the effect is muted. But for low- and middle-income households, those who shop at discount retailers, who rely on global supply chains for affordability, the impact is regressive. Food, clothing, basic household items, all are now more expensive. This, too, is part of the recalibration. The administration argues that short-term pain is necessary for long-term sovereignty. That dependence on foreign production, especially from strategic competitors, is dangerous. And so, it seeks to repatriate supply chains, re-industrialize the American economy, and shift the locus of value creation back onto domestic soil. But even if such a transformation were possible, it would take time. Decades of offshoring cannot be reversed in a single electoral cycle. And in the interim, American households are absorbing the cost of a transition whose benefits remain speculative. More importantly, the broader impact is structural. For 80 years, the trajectory of global trade policy was in one direction away from government interference. Countries slowly but steadily moved toward openness. They dismantled protectionist regimes. They reined in subsidies. They created multilateral frameworks and independent dispute mechanisms. The result was not utopia, but it was stability. Today, that movement has stalled. In some places, it is reversing. Companies that once competed in transparent global markets must now navigate a world of shifting rules. Instead of investing in innovation, they invest in strategy and rerouting supply chains to avoid tariffs, in manipulating invoices to reduce exposure, in lobbying for exemptions and carve-outs. The American business community, long a champion of deregulation and free enterprise, is adapting. Large corporations now send delegations to Washington, not to argue for open markets, but to request favorable treatment. Tariffs are not applied uniformly. Exemptions are granted. Political loyalty is rewarded, and a new era of industrial policy is quietly taking root. This is not unprecedented. It is, in fact, a return to a very old model one, in which governments act as gatekeepers to economic opportunity, where success depends as much on access to power as it does on the quality of a product. It is a model the United States once opposed. It is now one it embraces. What follows logically from a shift in American trade posture is a corresponding shift in the strategic behavior of other nations. If the world's largest economy, once the principal architect of a liberal trading order, now asserts that global markets are transactional arenas to be manipulated for advantage, then that message is not lost on its peers, its rivals, or its allies. Already, the early signs of adaptation are emerging. Governments and corporations alike are modifying their behaviors. Goods are being rerouted. Supply chains are being reorganized not for efficiency, but to evade tariffs. Products that once moved directly from point A to point B are now taking longer routes through third countries with more favorable trade relations. This is not merely an economic cost. It is a degradation of transparency. Under-invoicing of goods, over-invoicing of services, and classification shifts are becoming more common. These are not criminal behaviors in every case. They are adaptive responses to a system that no longer rewards straightforward trade. The more arbitrary the application of tariffs, the more elaborate the mechanisms to avoid them become. At the same time, lobbying has taken center stage. The largest and most politically connected corporations are increasingly shaping the rules under which they operate. Trade policy, once governed by institutions, frameworks, and multilateral negotiations, is now increasingly subject to bilateral deal-making and executive discretion. This creates clear winners and losers, not based on innovation or productivity, but on influence. The very same business leaders who once condemned regulation and state interference now seek out special treatment. They ask not for open markets, but for selective exemptions. The language of competitiveness has been replaced by the language of favor. And Washington, under the current administration, is willing to oblige. This is not unique to the United States. In fact, what is most notable is how the United States is now behaving like many of the very countries it once criticized. Countries where the boundary between political power and economic opportunity is blurred, where statecraft is inseparable from commerce, where trade is less a system and more a tool. In geopolitical terms, this creates a ripple effect. When the United States abandons its commitment to rules-based trade, other countries lose the incentive to maintain those rules. Bilateralism replaces multilateralism. Reciprocity becomes retaliation. Trust erodes, and the fabric of economic interdependence begins to fray. The architecture of peace, built on economic ties, weakens. For much of the post-war era, the underlying logic of global trade was not just economic, it was strategic. Countries that traded extensively with one another were less likely to go to war. Economic interdependence created shared interests. The cost of conflict became too high. The gains of cooperation were too great. This was not a naive belief. It was rooted in historical observation and reinforced by decades of relative peace among advanced industrial democracies. But interdependence only works when it is mutual and when the system is seen as fair. If economic ties are weaponized, if market access becomes a tool of coercion, then those same ties no longer restrain conflict. They provoke it. This is the danger of the current moment. The United States, by shifting its economic strategy, may be undermining one of the most successful peace-building mechanisms in modern history. Even beyond security implications, the structural reorientation of global commerce is accelerating. Countries are rethinking their exposure to U.S. markets. Strategic competitors are investing in regional alternatives. From the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership in Asia, to the African Continental Free Trade Area, to new bilateral agreements within Latin America and Eurasia, the momentum is toward diversification away from singular dependence on the American consumer. This is a rational response. If the largest market in the world is no longer reliable, then hedging becomes necessary.
From a shift
it is
in
not
American
simply
trade
about
posture
trade volumes.
is a corresponding
It is about
shift
trust,
in the strategic behavior
predictability,
of other nations.
the belief that
If the
agreements will
world's
be
largest
honored
economy,
across administrations,
once the principal
that markets are
architect of a
open for
liberal
economic
trading order,
reasons, not
now asserts
geopolitical
that global
ones.
markets
The
are
erosion of that
transactional arenas
belief
to be manipulated
has
for
long-term
advantage.
consequences.
Then that message
Over
is not
time,
lost on its
countries
peers,
may reduce
its
their
rivals,
holdings of
or
U.S.
its
debt.
allies.
They may pursue
Already, the
alternatives
early
to the
signs
U.S.
of
dollar
adaptation are
as the
emerging.
dominant reserve currency.
Governments and
They
corporations
may build
alike
parallel
are
systems
modifying
for
their
payments,
behaviors.
logistics,
Goods are
and
being
arbitration.
rerouted.
None of this
Supply
will happen
chains are being
overnight,
reorganized,
but the seeds
not
are
for
being
efficiency,
planted. The
but to
result
evade
is a more
tariffs.
fragmented global economy,
Products that once
one
moved
where supply
directly
chains
from
are
point A to
duplicated,
point B
costs are
are now
higher,
taking longer
and
routes
resilience
through
is
third
replaced with
countries
redundancy.
with more favorable
The
trade
dream of
relations.
global integration,
This
seamless,
is not merely an economic
efficient,
cost.
interconnected, is giving
degradation
way
of
to something
transparency.
else. A world of
Under-invoicing
blocks,
of goods,
buffers, and
over-invoicing
barriers.
of services,
In such a
and
world, power
classification
replaces
shifts
law.
are becoming more
Size
common.
matters more than legitimacy.
These are not criminal
And the
behaviors
small
in
economies,
every case.
the
They
developing
are adaptive
states,
responses to a system
the
that
emerging
no longer
markets
rewards straightforward
are left
trade.
to navigate a landscape where the
arbitrary the
rules are
application of
unclear
tariffs,
and the
the
alliances
more
unstable.
elaborate the mechanisms
This is
to
not the
avoid
vision
them
the
become.
United States once championed.
At the same time,
but it is the
lobbying
world
has
its
taken
current
center
policies
stage.
are helping to shape.
The largest
To
and most
understand the
politically
full
connected
scope of this
corporations
shift,
are
it is
increasingly
instructive
shaping
to
the
revisit
rules
history.
under which they operate.
The rise of the American-led
Trade policy,
economic
once
order
governed
after the
by
Second World War
institutions,
was not
frameworks,
inevitable.
and
It was a
multilateral
deliberate
negotiations,
construction,
is
the
now
result of
increasingly
institutions
subject
like
to
the
bilateral
General Agreement on
deal-making and
Tariffs and
executive
Trade,
discretion.
the Bretton Woods
This
system,
creates clear
the World
winners
Bank,
and losers,
and the International
not based
Monetary
on
Fund.
innovation or
At the core of
productivity,
that
but
system
on
was a belief in
influence.
openness.
The very same business
The United
leaders
States,
who once
more than
condemned
any other
regulation
nation,
and state
absorbed the
interference
costs of
now
maintaining
seek
that
out
openness.
special treatment.
It ran
They
trade
asked
deficits.
not for open markets,
It kept its markets
but for
open
selective
even when others
exemptions.
did not.
The
It provided
language of
security
competitiveness
guarantees that
has been
underpinned
replaced
global
by the
commerce.
language of favor.
This was not charity.
And Washington,
It was strategy.
under the current
By
administration,
anchoring the global
is
system,
willing
the
to
United
oblige.
States gained influence,
This is not unique to the
legitimacy,
United
and
States.
leadership.
In fact,
It created an
what is
environment where
most
liberal
notable
democracy
is how
could
the United
thrive,
States is now
where
behaving
innovation
like
was
many of the very
rewarded,
countries it
where
once
civil
criticized.
society expanded.
Countries
Today,
where the boundary between
that
political
calculation
power and
has
economic
changed.
opportunity is
The
blurred,
administration argues that past
where
policies were
statecraft
mistakes,
is inseparable from
that they allowed
commerce,
competitors to
where trade
rise,
is less a system
that they weakened
and more
American
a tool.
industry, that it is
In
time to
geopolitical
reclaim
terms,
economic
this
sovereignty.
creates a ripple
This is a
effect.
legitimate debate.
When the United
But the
States
manner in which it
abandons
is
its
being
commitment
pursued
to
through
rules-based
tariffs,
trade,
threats,
other
and
countries
transactional
lose the
bargaining
incentive
risks,
to maintain those rules.
undermining the very advantages the United
Bilateralism
States once
replaces
gained by playing the
multilateralism.
long game. Leadership
Reciprocity becomes
requires
retaliation.
consistency.
Trust
If the
erodes,
message to the world
and
is that
the fabric
American
of
policy
economic
changes every 4
interdependence
years,
begins to fray.
then partners will
The
plan
architecture
accordingly.
of peace built
They
on
will seek
economic
alternatives.
ties
They will
weakens.
build their own
For
systems.
much of the post-war
and in
era,
doing so,
the underlying
the
logic
leverage
of
the
global
United
trade
States
was
seeks
not
to
just
use
economic.
will
It was
diminish.
strategic.
This is not a
Countries
prediction.
that traded
It
extensively
is a
with one
pattern
another
already
were less
in
likely
motion.
to go to war.
The great irony is that
Economic
American companies,
interdependence created
long the
shared
champions of
interests. The
globalization,
cost of conflict
are now
became
being
too
forced
high.
to adapt to its
The
unwinding.
gains of cooperation
They
were
are
too
lobbying
great.
harder.
This was not
They are
a
building
naive belief.
factories in
It was
politically
rooted in
strategic
historical
states.
observation
They are
and
balancing between
reinforced by
compliance
decades of relative
and
peace
competition.
among
And
advanced
in this
industrial
environment,
democracies.
innovation
But interdependence
suffers.
only works
Talent
when it is mutual
diverted from
and when
science
the
to
system
strategy.
is seen as fair.
Capital
If
is allocated
economic
based
ties
on
are
politics,
If
not
market
productivity.
access becomes a tool
The
of
invisible
coercion,
hand
then
gives
those
way
same ties
to
no
the visible
longer
fist.
restrain conflict.
All of this
They
points to a
provoke it.
deeper truth. Economic policy is never just about economics. It reflects values, priorities, and visions of order. For most of the post-war era, the American vision was expansive. It believed that openness served both prosperity and peace, that the world was better when governed by rules, not rivalries. Today, that vision has narrowed. Trade is not about mutual gain, but relative position. Allies are not partners, but targets of opportunity. The world is not a system to be led, but a field to be dominated. This is not the only possible path, but it is the one currently being pursued, and its consequences are just beginning to unfold. The United States remains a formidable power. Its economy, military, and technological base are unmatched. But power alone does not ensure influence. Influence comes from legitimacy, from consistency, from a sense that leadership is more than strength, it is responsibility. The post-war order, with all its imperfections, offered a framework for cooperation. Its decline, marked by the rise of tariffs and the retreat of openness, suggests a different future. Not necessarily one of chaos, but one where the clarity of rules gives way to the uncertainty of interests, where trade is no longer a bridge between nations, but a battleground. The world is watching, and history will record whether this was the moment when the center held or when it began to fracture.